This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint, you deserve the best security.
New revelations about one of the biggest names in rock music. Skirmishes greet the holiest day of the Jewish calendar in Israel. It is Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12, usually in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet podcast. So, we have decided to take the whole idea of Sukkot and Ushpizin and guests a bit too far, like a notch up, I'd say. What have we not done so far, we said to ourselves? We said. No bungee jumping, no tandem parachuting yet. No swimming with dolphins, and no recording together in the same room. Up to now. We are not in a sukkah, we should stress that, but we are both in London. We are side by side here in the place where I usually record all on my own. Instead, we are two people together, two Jews on the news in one pod. This is very exciting, by the way. Don't peek at my notes. I am now realizing that I have, look at my notes. I'm on, we should say, something of a family vacation, which should be clear by the fact that I wrote my notes on the other side of unicorn coloring pages. And I have, and you're peeking at, so this is, this usual, not an unusual setup for us.
It is, because we're letting daylight in upon magic here, because normally it's a mystery to me how you prepare and produce the goods week after week, Yonit Levy, and yet now I can see how it's done, which is scribbled notes on the back, as you say, of children's colouring in pages. It's very, very high level here. And you, forget, the breaking the mystique for you. You are now in this room, which I really let hardly anybody see because it is, in my eyes, such a terrible mess of an office. Piles of books and papers everywhere. Normally no one is allowed in this room to see the chaos.
I think it's fantastic.
But I
think it's fantastic. There's so many books. It's overflowing with books.
Yeah, it is. It's basically an unfiltered and unsorted library we're here. So we are going to talk we
have to do the Jewish thing and ask how was fasting.
I think it was possibly my best ever fast. And instead of celebrating that, I just worry, because there's always a worry, but I have got progressively better and better at fasting as I get older. And I now think the fact that suddenly there was a category leap, it was even easier this year. And that makes me worried that I'm entering some sort of geriatric state where fasting becomes, almost natural, like as if the sort of body needs less and less to function. So I found it very, very easy this year. I feel for teenagers, I think, find it the hardest of all. But what about you? For you, how did you manage?
Usually it's pretty easy for me. This year, for some reason, I think I know the reason, I had trouble with, the only thing I really had trouble with was caffeine. I was like, I needed coffee.
But that must be always true.
I just think I probably sort of my intake is a little exaggerated. And I've talked to friends and they were like, oh, you need to lower your intake a few days before Yom Kippur. I was like, I never thought of that because I never had that problem. So I'm now,
because we didn't have our usual unholy traditional conversation before the fast of tips of how to fast. I didn't tell my story about Morris Davis, who always fasts on just two boiled eggs. Didn't tell those stories. But I did get a message from you on your way here saying, forget all the stuff about microphones and headphones and how we're going to record this. Have you got coffee on? And the caffeine addiction did kick in. So you left Israel behind, but when you left, the sort of dust was still not fully settled on what people have been calling the sort of Yom Kippur skirmishes. I mean, this is, of course, the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, where Israel was fighting and caught in a surprise attack by its external enemies. But Yom Kippur, the 50th anniversary one, was not a sort of moment of peaceful contemplation and unified reflection, but instead something else kicked off.
Yeah, I mean, this, as you said, the holiest of days, and what we saw was really angry scenes and fights and scuffles and friction. Actually, in some cases, I think people on both sides, crying, really. And what happened, essentially, in the center of this was in Dizengoff Square in Tel Aviv, where the Tel Aviv municipality decided that you can't have segregated or separated, prayers in a public place. We should say that most denominations do have those kinds of prayers inside the synagogue. But the Tel Aviv municipality decided that you can't have that in a public sphere. There was a specific organization in Hebrew called Harosh HaYehudi. Maybe the Jewish head would be the literal way of it. Sounds strange in English. But what they wanted to do is have this kind of separated prayer. They also petitioned the Supreme Court, which denied that, but they set it up anyway. And then in certain areas, groups of essentially affiliated with the protest movement, got into these kinds of skirmishes. Look, this is something you really don't want to see, not inside Israel, not looking from a diaspora. And I think that the responses to it, first of all, I think it shows just how divided Israeli society is these days. But the responses, I think, are something that we should look at. So first of all, Netanyahu said left-wing protesters were protesting against Jews. We see that the extreme left has, no norms, and this is not an exception. So this is regular rhetoric from Netanyahu in recent years. We should also say that Benny Gantz, who is something of a de facto leader of the opposition, although not, officially, said that this was a provocation. It doesn't really matter, though, Jonathan. I mean, even if this was done as a sort of provocation, it's still something you don't want to see.
Just in terms of the provocation, I'm interested in the decision by the Tel Aviv municipality to ban, in effect, public prayer. Public prayer in separation, not public prayer in general. They didn't want in a public place to have a separation, a gender separation between men and women. So were they, yes, absolutely. What led them to make that decision now, or were they themselves also firing a salvo in the culture?
Well, this is an organization that came. You're asking like the kids like to ask who started, right?
In a way.
So the organization itself, this Rosh Yehudi organization, wanted to do this prayer this year. They have examples of several other years, but they did it not only in Tel Aviv, we should say. So if you're asking the question who started, you can point the finger at them. Again, it doesn't really matter. The result is something that nobody really wanted, which are these skirmishes. I think we should notice what one particular politician is saying. It's not a name that's very known outside Israel. This is Chili Troper. He's really the right-hand man of Benny Gantz. He's from the kind of liberal side of religious Zionism. He thinks that Ben Gvir is a stain on Israeli politics. And he said, he wrote in a sort of painful post on Facebook, he wrote, we've been trying to bring in the people. I'm paraphrasing him. We've been trying to bring in the moderate rights, the moderate religious people into our group, into the camp of the anti-government, the anti-Netanyahu. If you will make this into just a secular against religious, or Tel Aviv against other parts of Israel, you are going to lose. That is essentially what he's saying, meaning that this event is kind of showing us that the protest movement has arrived at a fork in the road, right? That they need to decide, are they going towards this sort of moderate compromise aspect of it, or a more radical, fighting mode of it?
And when you say he's from the sort of liberal wing of religious Zionism, you mean they're the movement rather than the political party.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's important to say.
Small r, small z, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the fear that what has been until now a battle over, the role of the court and over democracy. No one wants it to become an internal religious war.
Right.
And that, in a way, that remark there is a kind of warning of where this would go. When you say, and people have been calling them skirmishes, I mean, was there a threat or, beyond sort of the odd scuffle of this turning to full-blown violence?
I think it could have turned into full-blown violence in what you were seeing. I mean, look, there are pictures of prayer books being torn on the floor, tefillin pulled, people crying. It could have turned more violent. And I think it's a very scary prospect.
But just the imagery itself is just very sort of distressing. And on Yom Kippur of all days, a point where everyone else in the Jewish world was, if they were observing it, were reflecting and were meditating, if you like. And this is sort of a very, very bleak contrast. There was a little gift for Israelis in quite a practical way, but also has huge diplomatic and political significance that came out of the State Department, namely the Israel being accepted into the visa waiver program. That's that list of countries, Britain is one of them, where you can enter the United States without a visa. You have to fill in a form online, and that waives the necessity.
But there could have been quite a chutzpah if they would have decided that Britain needs visa Like, that would be like a little bit,
Yeah, I mean, but,
we're kicking off the king and you guys need visa.
Well,
we're kicking out the king and you need
given
visa.
that you need to show your passport now to our 27 nearest neighbours, thanks to Britain's own decision to exit the European Union, I wouldn't have put it past us to manage to lose that right too. But no, America granting Israel entry into the visa waiver program, seen as being a sort of one of these long in the works things, but nevertheless a bit of a diplomatic breakthrough. It was certainly presented that way by Tony Blinken as a sort of positive gesture. You and I, and with our guests over recent weeks, have been talking a lot about the American-Israeli relationship. Just last week, Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu met at the UN in New York. How should we see this? Should we be seeing this as, yes, just the outgrowth of many years of diplomatic sort of shuttling at a lower level? Or is this part of that game of chess that's going on between Biden and Bibi about how, who's making nice with who?
That's a very good question, Mr. Friedland. Let's start with what actually happened here. This is a few years in the making. It started, I think, seriously with the Bennett, I want to say administration, with Bennett as prime minister, because essentially, why is this become possible? Because Israel agreed that Palestinian Americans, that is Palestinians living in the West Bank that have American citizenship, can travel freely to Ben Gurion Airport and then fly out. That is the one thing that Israel agreed to. Bennett agreed to it as prime minister. But, of course, the last person to open the jar, it doesn't matter if there are 10 people trying, the last person to receive this gift is, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu. We should maybe also remind our listeners that after he won the election and before his government was sworn in, that's when the legislation could have passed. He kind of pressed pause on that for a while. I remember talking to that with Tom Nice, the then ambassador to Israel, and then waited for him to assume office and give this gift. I think that the other question we were asking, which is really important, is this is obviously a very big gift from the American administration. And the question is, why give Netanyahu that gift? I would guess that the answer to that is that Netanyahu will give the Biden administration some sort of maybe acquiescence vis-a-vis the Iran deal, and either tacit approval or vocal approval of the issue of enriching uranium on Saudi soil as part of the Saudi deal. But anyway, he will have to give something in return for this huge gift.
Yeah, I did wonder, though, actually, when you're dealing with Netanyahu, and I'm sure Benny Gantz and the others would say this to Joe Biden, you should be the one to give your payment after you've received the goods from Netanyahu. This seemed to me a little bit of a mistake. I don't want to say Joe Biden's been a friar here and a bit of a sucker, but whenever I read this thing of, now he's done this, Netanyahu will have to give something else in return, I wonder. He may just put that in his pocket and then say, what have you got for me next? If I were Biden or advising him, I'd have said, do this visa waiver program thing after Bibi has given you something. If he hasn't, there's a risk that you look like a patsy. The other thing that was mentioned is that Joe Biden is going into an election year and just would like to shore up the votes of Jewish Americans and others. I'm not really buying that, partly because of the timing. I think if you were going to do that, you would do it in, the spring of 2024 rather than now. Yeah, feels a bit early for that. And also, I'm not sure how many votes really it moves. But he's now done it. And we'll have to see if he fares better than the likes of Benny Gantz, who themselves also gave Netanyahu what he wants and ended up feeling very disappointed.
So let's talk about what the Jewish world is looking at. Usually it is Israel. There have been a lot of weeks like that recently, but I think now there is a specific story, or rather a specific documentary, and this is a documentary about Roger Waters made by really television legend here in this country.
John Ware is an award-winning investigative journalist for many, many years with the BBC investigations programme Panorama. He has just made a new documentary online, which has already made waves within hours of its release. John Ware, welcome to Unholy.
Good morning.
It's very good to be with you. So the new film is called The Dark Side of Roger Waters being, for many years, the frontman of Pink Floyd. The group have disbanded, but he continues to tour and has made a whole lot of controversy. The film is, We'll get into exactly why in a second, but the film's unusual for you because it's not for the BBC, it's for a campaign group, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. Just tell us first off, before we get into the content of it, how that came about.
Well, I got a tip a few months ago that some emails existed in which Roger Waters had referred to Jews as kikes. I didn't know any more than that, except obviously that kike is about as bad as it gets. It's, Ku Klux Klan territory with that sort of terminology. So I was keen to try to see if I get my hands on it. And cut a long story short, that I did eventually. But I didn't do it through the BBC because I didn't think the BBC would do this story. Not because they, don't want to expose anti-Semitism. They do, but it just didn't fit into the sort of panorama format. So anyway, I took this to a charity, a UK-based charity called Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, because they are quite well resourced, and I knew this was going to take quite a lot of money to put together a film, and they have funded it. It's a very low budget film, and they've taken the legal risk, as indeed have I suppose, and that's how we got it on air.
There are two sort of key witnesses in this film. One is Bob Ezrin, who's obviously a music business legend in his own right. He's one of the producers of The Wall. And Norbert Stachel, who is his saxophonist. And we'll go into what they say. But the one thing I sort of had in my head watching it was, why now? Or maybe rather, why wait so many years? There are people who worked for him for decades, with him and for him.
Well, it's a good question. People are very apprehensive. I mean, we spoke to one or two other, former members of his band. People were apprehensive about, first of all, talking, and then particularly going on the record. Roger, so I gather, is a pretty litigious individual. So it took some persuading. So, I mean, I think in Ezrin's case, particularly, he'd had his sort of fill of Waters prancing around, various platforms in Europe and the UK, talking increasingly about recycling tropes, particularly in relation to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And he had an obligation, really, as someone who knew Waters, and also because he's Jewish, to speak out about it. And it was just the right time, I guess.
Well, let's just get into what the sort of key revelations are that you make in the film via these two key sources, these two people. What is it they tell you about Roger Waters that was not known before?
Well, I think many people had suspected that Roger Waters had, as it were, got a problem with Jews. Beyond some of his own recordings, where he spoke in a very conspiratorial way about, sort of Jewish, particularly Zionist alleged omnipotence and those sort of classic tropes, we hadn't actually got any evidence of what he said in private. The new material really is, first-hand witness conversations that Roger had with our witnesses and others about Jews. Particularly, for example, they were at a Lebanese restaurant, and Roger's many members of his band were fed up because the waiter keeps bringing vegetable dishes and not meat, and they wanted meat, and so Roger, when this hapless waiter brings yet another a dish of vegetables, Roger apparently explodes and says, what's with this Jew food? Take this Jew food away. Why vegetables are Jew food as opposed to any other sort of food, I really don't know, but that is what he's alleged to have said. And so Norbert, the saxophonist, spoke about how uncomfortable he felt. He didn't feel he could express his Jewishness without getting sort of quizzical looks from more snipey remarks. And he tells another story of how, what sounds to me, frankly, a bit like sort of baiting. Roger likes to, so it is, and we got this from several members of his band, he likes to sort of hold these large dinners, and, very good dinners. But there's Roger at the head of the dinner table holding forth. And he picks on Norbert Stachel, the saxophonist, who hasn't been with the band for very long. And he says, Norbert, tell us a little bit about yourself. And so Norbert starts to tell everybody that, his parents came, I think, from Minsk and from Poland, and explains that he lost his grandparents in the war under the Nazis. And so then Roger says, so did you meet your grandparents? He says, no, I never met them. He said, well, let me introduce you. He says, I'm pretty good at imitations. I'm going to introduce you to your grandmother. Whereupon he does this sort of slapstick imitation of how he, Roger Waters, imagines some peasant woman, Jewish woman, presumably, talking in Yiddish and that sort of thing. And Norbert is just looking at this guy and thinking, what is this? And at the end of it, Waters says, there, I've introduced you to your grandmother. And I think Norbert was so thrown by this, he just went off to his room and phoned his wife and said, I'm with a bunch of lunatics.
I mean, it really is one of the shocking, maybe the most shocking stories is what you just told about this impersonation. It kind of comes out somewhat of a bully, kind of poking these people to bring it out in them, like to make them feel terribly uncomfortable.
That's the other defining character of how Waters treats other people. And it wasn't just from these two witnesses who went on the record either, that he is a bully, that he likes to press buttons. And, he's got an enormous ego. He clearly is a complicated character. But people my impression is that not many people like him very much because he is a bully and he does throw his weight around. And although there are sort of rather schizophrenically examples of empathy with personal tragedies, he could be very difficult and unpleasant. And yeah.
There've been these arguments about Roger Waters for a long time, where some hail him as this great defender of Palestinian rights, of human rights in general. Others say he traffics in conspiracy theory. He insists the white helmets in Syria are fake, for example. He's got a whole lot of theories. What you've done here is said that beyond that argument about his public positions, there is, for want of a better word, a kind of social anti-Semitism there that expresses itself in private. The stories you've just told, sort of taunting someone, saying, about their Holocaust victim grandparents, but even at one point singing a little ditty that ends, the last two words are effing Jew. And Bob Ezrin, a big figure in the music industry, was privy to that and heard that and tells you that.
I think Ezrin felt it was directed at him, Jonathan. So, sorry, I'm interrupting, but I mean, the idea, it's a long time ago, and Ezrin isn't, clear after 40 years the precise details, but, what stays in his head is this guy just kind of coming up with some ditty, because he's a songwriter, is Roger, about Brian Morrison, Pink Floyd's agent, who is also Jewish, and thinks he gets some sort of visceral delight out of, testing Ezrin's reaction to a really sharp provocation. Effing Jew. Maury is an effing Jew. It's kind of, how do you feel about that?
No, well, what
Bob?
I was going to say is, what does this do to the argument that has already happened until now, in which he has said, Roger Waters, all this is political, that when he wanted to use the K word, the word kike, on that display, it was part of his big political project of anti-fascism, in which he is mocking fascism. That's always been his defense. He uses this horrible language. There's one line in one of the songs about getting queers and Jews up against the wall and shooting them. He says that's all anti-fascist. What does it do to that argument that you have now uncovered, that in private he expresses views which those who heard it considered personally anti-Semitic?
Essentially, you're asking, where does it leave his protestations that this is only about the Israel-Palestine conflict? Well, I think it leaves them on the floor, to be perfectly honest with you. And here's the point. A lot of people have given him the benefit of the doubt on that argument. There clearly are some groups who will never be persuaded, I think, that he has a problem with Jews. But I do think, at least I hope, those with a more open mind will see a character that behind his zealotry on the Israel-Palestine conflict does lie a whole lot of sort of subliminal prejudices about how Jews are, not just Zionists. Now, he makes a distinction between Jews and Zionists, but of course, as we all know, most Jews are Zionists, and Zionism comes in many different forms. But Roger doesn't really make that distinction. I mean, whether you want to call it anti-Semitic or he's got a problem with Jews, I don't really see the difference myself. He's got a problem with Jews. I mean, that's my view.
To our listeners who don't know, you're also behind the expose on labor anti-Semitism, and you came under fire then from Corbyn's acolytes. Do you think are you kind of expecting the same blowback from people who are just kind of continuing Jonathan's question, who are going to say, no, you just misunderstood him?
Well, it's only, whatever it is, about 18 hours since we streamed, so it's early days. I haven't had anything yet, but it will astonish me if I don't get some abuse, and it's sort of par for the course, really. There is quite an interesting thing going on with Corbynism, by the way, while we're on it, and Rogers has been part of this. The extent to which some groups are sort of trying to revise the history of the Corbyn years, that essentially it was a smear, it was confected. And actually, this is a point. I mean, if this film, again, dislodges some of those people who are sort of open to the idea that, history should be revised over the Corbyn years, that I'd be pleased with that, because it's a myth, that there wasn't a problem in the Labour Party.
I'm always wary of this because you never know what's in people's background. But I think, John, that you are not yourself Jewish. Correct me if I'm wrong about that. And yet it feels like this has become something of a mission for you, one way and another. Tell us about that.
Oh, gosh. Well, no, I'm not Jewish. My kids are, because my wife is. I mean, it's a long story. If you really want to know the answer, Jonathan, it goes back to when I was a teenager thinking of going into the British Army, and I was watching BBC reports about the Six-Day War, and I learned about the extraordinary imbalance in forces, and I was just mesmerized, and I sort of thought, who are these guys that can win in 6 days against insurmountable forces? And I just sort of got a bit hooked on all that, and did the usual thing that lots of people of my age did, went off to a kibbutz, but and then just became really captivated, I suppose, by the remarkable story of Jewish survival, resilience, and all of those things. And I know people will expect me to have a sort of throat clearing about, the West Bank and Israel, and I've done all that, and I've got very strong views about it, but it doesn't change fundamentally the miracle of Jewish survival.
The film is The Dark Side of Roger Waters. You can get it anywhere on social media. I'm sure if you just Google it, it will come up. It's just over half an hour long and extremely hard-hitting. John Ware, broadcasting legend, investigative reporter of huge acclaim. Thanks so much for coming on Unholy.
Great pleasure.
Thank you, John. I love that answer by him. That was a beautiful thing to say. And it really does, because I didn't want I waited for you to bring up, I thought it was a chutzpah to ask as an Israeli, like, you're not Jewish, why do you care? But I was waiting for you to ask that question. His answer was just perfect.
And it reminded me, and it's not just because they're both Brits, but it reminded me actually a bit of Dame Helen Mirren's answer when we sort of talked about how involved you are with Israel. Once again, it was about 1967, the miracle, as he put it, of Jewish survival after the Holocaust. A lot of John Ware's work, incidentally, was about, related to Nazi war criminals on the run and things. And it did just make me wonder if, there is a kind of body of people, a generation really of people whose views of Jews and Israel were really formed in that period. Mm-hmm. And, perhaps we say this often here, but I'm not sure the future John Wares, the generation of documentary makers and journalists coming up, have anything like that similar kind of attachment. But it's led him to make some really important work. And as you said, I think many people in the Jewish world are going to be talking about this documentary because they've been thinking and debating Roger Waters for a long time, and now a whole lot of new findings on that subject. So great to have John Ware on the podcast. We are going to maintain our tradition, even as we sit here in our metaphorical podcasting sukkah together, side by side. Traditions do have to be observed. And one of them, of course, is our awards. Normally, very often, it is you who ends up handing out the Chutzpah Award. So we're going to reverse that this time because my eye was caught early on, really, in the week by this affair in Canada. I don't think we've talked about Canada often enough on the podcast, but people will have heard about the visit. Volodymyr Zelensky's been on the road. He's been going everywhere. He had the big honor of addressing the Canadian Parliament. As part of that, he was encouraged to applaud a Ukrainian citizen, a 98-year-old Yaroslav Hunka, aged 98, who had been called a hero by the Speaker of the Parliament, hailed for his service fighting for Ukraine in the last war. Well, guess what? It then turned out that the man in question, the honoured guest in the gallery of the Canadian Parliament, was a military veteran indeed, but his service had been with the 14th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division, a voluntary unit made up mostly of ethnic Ukrainians who had fought under Nazi command. And that unit has a charge sheet against it of having killed Polish and Jewish civilians, among others, who you immediately started thinking managed to invite that guy to stand in the public gallery so that Volodymyr Zelensky, because he thought you should, was applauding a man with an SS track record. Well, the Speaker of the Canadian Parliament, Speaker of the Canadian House of Commons, Anthony Rota, put his hand up and said, that he bears responsibility. So a bit of a chutzpah award for him for really not giving some thought to, if you've got a 98-year-old Ukrainian veteran, you kind of might want to look.
Vet him. Just vet him for a sec.
Yeah, vet the veteran. It's not rocket science in this case. So a chutzpah award to Anthony Rota, but credit to him for at least quitting.
I mean, first of all, I kind of want to give him the mensch because this story almost feels like it was written for our podcast. But, he's not, I agree he took responsibility and he resigned, but he wasn't the only one applauding. So maybe others should also say, and
fair.
apologize. But I mean, just too good a story to ignore. Can I ask a question about mensch? Because by the way, I'm on vacation. Not that I want to take the mensch award,
so
but
you should get the mensch.
No, that's not I am self-involved. No. That's not what I was leading to. Just that I could have sat this whole time, just looked at you doing the show and just brought up the mensch award, and that's it. Like that's what I could have been doing.
Yes.
And not like working hard at no, okay.
I know, you could have done that. And instead, heroically, you did turn up.
So I want to give our mensch award to, I think it's okay. I think it's valid because we did give it to a teddy bear once. So I think it's okay to give it to a dog, right? I think so.
But you are here. You haven't actually met Freddie, even though you've come here, Freddie the dog, in our household. He wasn't here when you arrived. He will be back here later. Or do you have another dog in mind?
We can give it to Freddie as well. Are you okay with that? We'll give it. Okay. Separate mensch award to Freddie, and who agreed to leave the house to give us some quiet time to record the podcast. So we want to give this mensch award to Buddy and Hartley, 2 dogs. The story comes from Michigan. A 2-year-old toddler named Thea Chase went missing. Her mother, Brooke, noticed that, and she looked for her daughter, and she also noticed that the 2 dogs were missing. She was looking for them for hours, and then she found the 2 dogs and her daughter. Her daughter was resting on one of the dogs, kind of using the dog as a pillow, and the other dog was protecting them, and this is a lovely story. And this is what I wanted to tell you in Sukkot. I think it's fine. I think we can give the mensch award this way. Do you agree?
I think we definitely can. Those 2 dogs protecting the little 2-year-old girl in the woods. I mean, a little babe in the woods is so sweet. And the first account I read of this was that, and I don't know whether this was from Thea's own description, age 2, but the first news report I read of this said that she was using one of the dogs as a fluffy pillow. as she was
sweet.
lying in the woods. So it's an adorable story. If you're not a dog lover yet, I think this will
convince you.
It will
turn you.
It will convince you because it's an act of really Menschlichkeit by the two dogs, Buddy and Harley. Well done. A Mensch Award on its way to you. Freddie gives way. He recognises that you have been bigger Mensches than him this week.
Go save a toddler, Freddie.
Yeah, exactly. Don't get any ideas. If you have enjoyed this episode of Unholy, do rate and review us in all the usual places and channels. Do spread the word.
And we will say thank you to Gaia Glaser, Omer Primat, Rom Atik. I'm not leaving your house. I'm just staying. I'm just going to stay.
Yeah, we've got another
podcast. Even though
podcast
I got
next
the
week.
less comfortable chair, I'm just saying. There's
true.
one comfortable chair in this room. I did not receive it. But, maybe next week.
That is unfortunately true. It was partly just the setup here. If people could see, it is pretty, the corners and everything else, it didn't really work another way. Okay, next week you get the better chair. We will see you next week. Yonit's obviously going to stay here for the next 7 days. We'll have to work around that. But we'll see you with Unholy next week.
See ya.
This podcast is brought to you by cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.